Let's take a minute and talk about the types of variables in an experiment. Usually an experiment comes about because somebody notices something. For example, suppose you see these kids playing on a swing and you notice that for some reason one kid seems to take longer to make a complete swing than the other. And you said to yourself, I wonder why that is. Well, we've got a question to find. Why is it that the kids take a different amount of time to make a complete swing? So we look at the situation and we come up with possible factors. What are things that may be playing a role? And when we look at this picture of the kids on the swing, one of the first things that we notice is, well, the kids are different. Maybe they're different masses. Maybe one of them's bigger than the other. And maybe it's the mass of the child that makes a difference in how long they swing. Another possible factor, we might notice that the swings are slightly different length. And so maybe it's the length of the swing that makes a difference in how long it takes to make a complete swing. And then we may also notice that they're going different distances. Maybe one kid is going farther back than the other. And so we decide, well, maybe it's the amplitude that makes a swing or makes a difference in the time of the swing. So all of these are the possible factors. All of these could be variables. So the next step then, we set up our experiment. And the experiment we could, I suppose, actually do the experiment with a real swing and real children, but usually that's kind of frowned upon. So we set up some sort of a lab situation. So suppose we make a pendulum to stand in for the kids. And so we've got this pendulum hanging there, and we want to design the experiment. And the first thing is, now we need to identify our variables. The first variable that we need to identify is the independent variable. Of all those possible variables that we mentioned, we want to test just one of them at a time. And the independent variable is the thing that you decide to test. It's the variable that I can control, and I'm going to change that one to see if it makes any difference. For example, let's design an experiment here around changing the mass. Suppose we take this pendulum and we decide, well, we could make the mass smaller or we could make the mass larger. The mass is going to be our independent variable. Then the dependent variable is the thing that we test to see if any change happens when you change the independent variable. For example, the independent variable goes back to our original question. We wondered, well, what is it that makes a difference on the amount of time that it takes the kids to swing? So the dependent variable would be the time of the swing. So that's kind of our data. That's what we're going to measure. I'm going to change the independent variable and then collect data on the dependent variable to see if it makes any difference. So the dependent variable then would be the amount of time that it takes to make one complete swing all the way out and all the way back. Then finally we said, well, there are some other things that may play a role here. The length of the swing might end up playing a role. The amplitude of the swing might end up playing a role. So to make sure that our experiment is a fair test, we want to control those things. So anything that we control to make sure that it's the same for all experiment, those things then would be called the controlled variables. So in this experiment, we'd want to make sure that we have the exact same length of the pendulum every single time, and we want to make sure that we pull it back the exact same distance, so the amplitude is the same every time. So to summarize, the independent variable is the variable that I control, the one that I'm testing. The dependent variable is the one that I measure to see if the independent variable made any difference, and the controlled variables are all of the other things that I've identified that could possibly make a difference, but we want to make sure it's a fair test, so we hold those things the same for all of the trials of our experiment.